This is a Carboline production.
Is paint sustainable? Can coatings manufacturers make their products sustainably? Why should anyone take us seriously on this subject? On this episode of the Red Bucket Podcast, no greenwashing allowed. Sometimes when two separate decent ideas collide, you end up with one really great one. And that's what's happening in this episode, because one idea was that I wanted to have today's guest on the podcast and it wouldn't have mattered what the subject was. And the other idea was to accept the challenge of having a smart discussion on sustainability, and specifically how we can achieve greater sustainability through selecting inorganic coatings for corrosion protection. So to help us understand this is Kristen Blankenship, who I'm pleased to have introduce herself now.
Well, thank you very much, Toby. This is my first time on this podcast, and I'm excited to be here. I have been in this industry for over 2 decades, going on 3, which is mind-boggling. I have been most of my career behind a bench, a laboratory bench, formulating many different types of paint and coatings. Recently, I joined Carboline, and I am our global product line manager for atmospheric coatings. So these are all the paints and coatings that see the sun, the wind, the rain, and keep our structures intact. I have a bachelor's of science in chemistry, so I know a little bit about molecules, not a lot, but a little bit. And I have spent my career in all different types of paint and coatings, anywhere from UV curable coatings, powder coatings, water-based coatings, solvent-based thermoset coatings, for markets ranging from cosmetic packaging to automotive OEM to architectural curtain wall and coil coatings, and of course where I am today, which is really heavy-duty industrial coatings for steel and concrete.
Before recording, we plotted out how we wanted this conversation to unfold, and where we landed might sound silly when I say it out loud, but it was to begin from the beginning. So, Kristen, what is a protective coating supposed to do?
Excellent question. And it's one of the things that I have peppered into some of my presentations, depending on the audience. When they wake up in the morning and find out that they're going to sit through an hour-long discussion on paint, that doesn't really get them that excited. So I have to try. And sometimes I start with just talking about the earliest types of paint, which actually our ancestors that lived in caves used. So if you think of old cave art, that was usually a red ochre type pigment. And in the very early stages, they probably put that in a little bit of water. And what they found is that, wow, my drawing or my message or whatever wasn't there very long, because water evaporates and what you're left with is a powder that just falls off the wall or blows away. So they got a little smarter and they started putting it in animal fat. Animal fat is composed primarily of organic material, carbon-based material, and it doesn't evaporate away. So all those particles of pigment are stuck in that sticky animal fat, and they stay around for quite a long time, as we know, as we walk into these old caves and we see these drawings that are ancient. So humans have used paint and coatings to express themselves for as long as we've probably existed, which I think is kind of cool. When you get into the world of protective coatings, it's a whole different ballgame. You are actually trying to use those coatings functionally, and primarily it's to maintain what we would call the substrate or the material of construction from degradation.
I want to bring sustainability into the conversation now. I realize it can be frustrating for folks who care about this subject because so often they're hearing people make sustainability noises without any substance. I'm one of those people. I care about it. I know you are too. So we don't want to just add to that noise. With that said, Kristen, where does sustainability enter the picture in relation to protective coatings?
Protective coatings protect substrates from degradation, and we have to think about what those substrates are. And they could be something as small as a component of an automobile. They could be the shell of an aircraft. If the aluminum alloy that's used to construct the aircraft starts corroding, and of course it's corroding underneath the paint, it's hard to see, and a bolt or a rivet comes loose. Well, paint and coatings actually keep planes from falling out of the sky. So it's a pretty big deal. When it comes to sustainability, though, the way I look at this is a 60-story tower in Manhattan. That building, we want to stay up for a very long time. And the reason, primarily, the carbon footprint of constructing that building is significant. I'll just say that way. The architectural community, which has really taken the lead when it comes to looking at the sustainability of the materials that they use, had pretty much an awakening probably 10 years ago. They spent a lot of time trying to reduce the operational carbon of the structures they designed. So that was all the stuff when you look at Energy Star and you look at optimizing your temperature and your climate control in your building so that you're not cooling it down as more than you really need and letting it stay too warm. It's an optimal climate condition, so you're not using more energy than you need. So all those things are the building's constructed, you turn the lights on, that's the operational carbon. And they thought, wow, we did a great job. We've got energy efficient windows so they don't leak, right? What they discovered is almost half, if not more, of the carbon that's released to the atmosphere in the form of CO2 actually is created in just constructing that building. So, wow, we've got to go back and we've got to look at what they call embodied carbon. So if you think of a building, half of the carbon that's emitted is in the construction of that building. So if the building has to be reconstructed, that's a significant impact. If you can apply a protective coating to the shell of that building so that it lasts twice as long, that's a significant impact of savings from CO2 emitted to the environment compared to the small amount of CO2 that'll be emitted in the production and application of the paint. So one of the things we talked earlier about how I've been in this business a long time, and sometimes when you think about being in the paint industry, that's certainly not sexy. When you think about why paints are still around and why they are still used, it's very simple. It's a very, very thin film of a material that can protect enormous structures. So it's very little material that can have an enormous impact on protecting a very large structure from degradation. So it's very efficient in its ability to protect. And that's why they're still around. And that's why we still keep making them.
It makes sense at this point to let everyone know that we're not going to gloss over the fact that there is a negative environmental impact associated with collecting and processing the raw materials that we use to make coatings, or the impact associated with our manufacturing processes. And of course, downstream from there, there's all the transportation of our products and the application of our products, characteristics of our products that release compounds into the atmosphere. So look, we do things that pollute Earth. Let's be straightforward about it.
I do think that's what my advice has been, is that instead of trying to turn Carboline into this granola crunchy company, we have to accept what we are. We're a chemical company, and we use toxic materials all day, every day, but we use them to make assets withstand the elements so they don't have to be replaced. And the carbon footprint of replacing a large structure is astronomical compared to the impact of just repainting it. We've done a great job, I would say, in reducing the harmfulness of the toxicity to human health. We're still working on that, but there's, the people working in our facilities, it's a lot safer today than it was 20, 30 years ago. We started understanding a little better that, wow, toluene and isocyanates, diisocyanates, monomeric isocyanates, when you breathe those in, they don't have the greatest effect on human health, and they actually have a chronic effect. So we didn't find out about this, unfortunately, for decades. So we had people working in these labs, they were getting sick. So again, you start understanding all of that, so you start moving away from that. And I will tell you, there's been a magnificent shift from when I started in the late 90s in the paint lab versus today. In the late 90s, most paint companies were not proactively moving away from VOC. They were reactive. So the government would mandate, one state couldn't use a certain solvent. Well, they would wait until the very last second, and they would make a special paint for that state, and they would still make the solvent-based materials for all the other states. That is changing. And honestly, it's because there's a market for that. Everybody knows that that's the direction we're going in. Most younger people coming into the industry, they don't want to work with toxic materials. They're smart. They do their research. So there is a value proposition in offering a material that maybe you don't have to offer through regulation, but there is a value proposition in that it is healthier for you. Just look at our food, Whole Foods and all these other natural food markets that, 10 years ago people thought were too expensive. Well, now they think it's worth it because I think they're more healthy for me. Again, that's a personal choice, but that's just kind of how I would say the market of sustainability has changed. Yes, many of the materials that we use still have some components that are emitting CO2 to the environment. But again, that amount of carbon that's emitted from producing the paint and applying it versus the carbon emitted from having to rebuild an entire building, it's quite a difference.
So a couple of remarks come to mind for me based on what you've just said. First, I think the more that anyone digs into the technical or materials aspect of sustainability, they'll realize that it's a game of trade-offs. Rarely will anyone simply be able to crank the dial down from I am polluting to I am not polluting. So I think somebody would set themselves up for disappointment if they hold on to that expectation, right? We in the coatings industry might ask you, well, what do you want us to do? Do you want us to just never make a coating? Do you want us to stop coating assets? Go ahead and see what would happen. And the other point that I want to toss in, as we study internally the impacts of our products or their raw materials have on the environment, it's come as a pleasant surprise to me to see how many of those products that have been around a long time end up being quite sustainable. We wouldn't have described them that way 2 or 3 or 4 or even 5 decades ago. In some cases, some of these products have been around that long. We wouldn't have described them that way because we didn't have the vocabulary and we didn't have the ways of measuring that like we do today.
Consider really how a lot of our modern paint systems came to be. You really go back to World War II and all of the efforts in manufacturing weapons of war. And one of those is a lot of rubber for rubber tires. And rubber tires use something called latex. So that's a carbon-based material that's immersed in water. And so during the war, we were making a lot of tires for planes and all kinds of vehicles. And then, thankfully, the war ended. And then, well, these manufacturing facilities, what do they do now? And so, honestly, a lot of modern resin technology actually got its start from those materials. So, in life, I think we all know that there's a lot of happenstance and right place, right time. It's not necessarily that we all sit around and have the time and luxury to come up with what is ideal and what is best. We use what is available and we work with what we know. So as we got better at making these protective coatings more resilient, one of the ways we did that is we had them react with each other. So part A, part B, you get a cross-link system. And we also found that those resins that we were creating, they were very soluble in solvent. And these are organic solvents, not water. And those solvents allowed us to have very easy application with a very smooth finish. And if you think about where a lot of paint was used many years ago, well, cars, automobiles, big boom there, and an application for paint. And we want our cars to look really nice and no orange peel and all of that. So a lot of the resin technology was centered around that. Again, focused on application and appearance, not necessarily about human health, frankly, because we didn't really know. To your point, there are some old materials, and I always think of alkyds. As a paint formulator, alkyds are very old. But when you think about them from a sustainability piece, they're made partially based on plant oils. So they have this renewable feature built into them, even though they are a very old technology. So sometimes what's old is new. And I would also say to that, when you think of building materials, there's kind of been this renaissance of using the natural material. And so there are some architects that think they have this romance with, I want to use the real wood through a sustainably farmed forest. And that might be okay with wood, but if you think about stone, for example, stone's very heavy. It's very hard to machine. It takes a lot of energy to do that. So if you actually look at the embodied carbon of using real stone versus a facade that gives that effect, you might be surprised that the embodied carbon of the real stone may actually be higher. I don't know that to be true in all cases, but those are the questions that are being asked every day, all day in the building world, in the materials world. Another area where something that is quite old has actually seen a little bit more of a renewed interest is in the actual resins that are used to make protective coatings themselves. So as I said earlier, a lot of organic polymers are traditionally what we think of when we think of paints. You've heard of acrylics, you've heard of polyesters, I mentioned alkyds. But back in the 60s, and actually prior to that, I would say as early as the 30s, I even found a reference to it in the late 1800s out of England. But really the 30s and beyond, there's a resin system based on silicate chemistry. So not really carbon-based, but more inorganic in nature. And it has been around for, as I said, the 30s, really gained an increase of usage in the 60s, and has been used for some time, even up to today. But now, because again, there's a changing focus on the materials that we're using and how impactful they are, there is this idea that these inorganic silicates, if you have a structure that's offshore, say you have a windmill or you have an offshore drilling rig, and you're trying to protect that steel, it's a very harsh environment, a lot of salts, a lot of wind that's very abrasive and erosive to the coating. And a lot of those structures are coated with a 3-coat organic system. They'll have a zinc-rich primer, they'll have an epoxy mid-coat, and usually a urethane or even a polysiloxane top coat. But most of the time it's a urethane. And it's a very high-performance protective coating system. It lasts usually 20, 30, 40 years. But over the course of its life, it will see some erosion, which means that the photochemical degradation process will occur. It really starts with the carbon-carbon bonds. The UV light will attack them. And at a microscopic level, you start getting breakage of those bonds, and that yields itself to micro cracks and pores. And then it's a cascading effect where you actually lose particles of the paint film. And where do those particles go? They go into the ocean, and they're polymers. So one of the areas where we're looking at trying to avoid that is in offshore, and a silicate resin system that does not have carbon in the final film is one approach to that. Essentially, you could call it sand that's finding its way back to the ocean.
Can you talk about water-based coatings? Because as I understand it, if we're talking from a sustainability perspective, if a manufacturer wants to seem like they're sustainable but not really work hard at being sustainable, then they might say, hey, look at these water-based coatings.
So when you think about something as simple as water-based coatings, which is something that for probably the last 15 years, if you have any children, you're always concerned, okay, I want to keep them safe. How do I paint the nursery? And you see these lovely commercials, say 0 VOC paint, and they have the little, the baby bed and the baby, and you think, okay, this is safe, right? 0 VOC, sometimes there's an asterisk. Sometimes there are things in there called plasticizers. You do have to you really do have to educate yourself. And the great thing is we have something called the internet now, where even a layperson can reasonably get a decent answer if they're really curious about what something means. So again, back to the water-based coatings, that was going to be the end all be all, and now everything is safe and it's green. Well, water takes a long time to evaporate. It takes a lot of heat if you want to make it evaporate quickly, or it just takes a long time out in the field. And so there is an energy component to water. A lot of water-based coatings, because of their nature and because you're putting oily things into them, they don't always protect as well. And so anybody that's stained their deck with a water-based stain, I think hopefully they've made those a little better. What's really the point of using a water-based stain if you have to redo it within a year because it's falling off? And what's falling off is organic material that is basically plastics. So again, these are all things that we're trying to learn. We're trying to understand. I was in college and I took a class called Industrial and Environmental Chemistry, and I'll never forget. It was populated, half were biology majors and half were chemists. And in class, it seemed as though the biology majors always looked at us chemists as the evil, mad scientists that were polluting the earth. The funny part, the ironic part, is they were all drinking coffee out of their plastic mugs. Neither side was evil, right? We were all doing what we knew to do when we were doing it. And we just have to be open that we don't know all the answers. We don't have all the answers. So again, water-based coatings, not as green as they may seem. And at the same time, when you think of an industrial 3-coat protective system and you think, you hear the word inorganic zinc-rich primer, well, that doesn't sound very green. But when you actually look at what's behind it, again, inorganic zinc-rich primers actually are based on silicate resins. And those are those resins that don't have those carbon bonds. We talked earlier about the erosion, and if the silicates do break down, they return basically as sand to the ocean. But the other thing to keep in mind is that silicates, that bond, so that's a silicon-oxygen bond, so there's your chemistry for the day, that bond is actually resilient to UV degradation. So it actually will stay there longer. So sometimes things sound scary and they sound worse than they actually are. And so I think what we have to come to as a society, especially in the materials world, and the good news is I'm seeing this. I am seeing as more industry gets involved in the regulatory bodies and the decision-making process when it comes to sustainability, now we're having more sober-minded conversations, less hysterical conversations, less pointing fingers at all the evil scientists in the room that are polluting the earth, and appreciating that we're all trying to do what we need to do. We used organic solvents for years because they actually save time and energy. They made us, produce paint and apply it to the part and get it off the assembly line faster. And that's what everybody wanted. It wasn't because we all sat around at the table and thought, how am I going to, pollute the earth and harm people? Of course, we didn't think that. We learn that as we go, and we do our best to try to find new ways of doing things when we learn that something isn't as good as it should be. And sometimes it's sitting right beneath their feet and we didn't even realize it. And that's kind of what's been going on in the world of resin chemistry when we think about these silicate resins. Most paint formulators, they know epoxies, they know acrylics, they know alkyds. But when it comes to silicate chemistry, it's kind of this little known animal that hasn't really been studied much. My prediction is that will change as people realize that this is a viable option. There are some trade-offs. I think you mentioned that earlier. There's always trade-offs. Silicate chemistry usually comes in a matte or low sheen finish. And for those of us that really enjoy bright and shiny, well, you're not going to get that with these types of resins, at least not so far that we know of. But again, those are things that we have to think about. I know in the bridge community, there's, we've kind of gotten used to these shiny bridges where we can have color. But when we think about the impact of repainting, what that entails, usually that entails blasting old paint off, which means we have to have containment because, again, we don't want to pollute the river below the bridge. So we know that that's a bad thing. We have to have containment. Well, we also have to shut down traffic lanes. So that means cars sitting idle, emitting carbon dioxide. So the bridge community, definitely the DOTs, they know we want corrosion protection systems that last longer. We don't want to mobilize painting crews out there, every 5 to 10 years to touch up and maintain these bridges. if that means that we need a different finish or a different aesthetic, you know what? It's worth the trade-off.
You'll have to take my layman's opinion for what it's worth, but I share that mindset, especially in the context of sustainability, where you've pointed out there are coating solutions out there that last longer and that reduce the impacts on environmental and human health, not to mention these can save a truckload of money. And then when somebody says, oh, but it doesn't look as nice and shiny, I am so tempted just to say, cry me a river, because it's not a beauty contest. Again, that's my layman's opinion. But it does lead me to ask that if we've had these longer lasting resin technologies for as long as you said that we've had them, I heard you say the 1930s, 1920s, maybe even late 1800s in some cases, then why didn't those gain the traction that, from my vantage point here and now, I think that they should have?
Well, that also might go back to a little bit of where the feedstocks come from. So if you think about organic binders, the feedstocks primarily go all the way back to the oil that we pump out of the ground. And so when we were in an oil boom, there were a lot of companies that popped up because they had, a downstream byproduct that they could leverage. So all these processes, when you're processing oil, there's all these byproducts. Well, what do you do with those, right? You try to make money off of it somehow. And so that's where all these companies popped up. So a lot of the raw materials that are used in organic paints really came from that. I know there were a few chemical companies in the coatings industry that had a lot of history in glass and still do to this day. And that's, again, there's related downstream and upstream byproducts. And so that's typically how these raw materials come up is we've got this byproduct. What do we do with it? We don't really want to just, if we throw it away, we're not making any money on it, right? And a lot of times we have to pay to throw it away, especially these days. So that's where a lot of these materials kind of came up. And in the coatings industry, you have a bunch of chemists and formulators, and that's what they're focused on. And so it's versions upon a theme. So when you think about epoxy chemistry, there's all kinds of different iterations, Novolac epoxies, there's phenalkylamines, polyamides. When you think about alkyds, there's long oil, short oil. I think that is a lot of why we see so much in the area of organic materials because of the feedstock itself. When it comes to silicates, it's a different production mechanism, a different synthesis. So that to me is why you really didn't have a lot of focus on those raw materials. But now, because of the pressures that we see when it comes to sustainability and impact, these are materials that are being looked at again. I know for our company, we do environmental product declarations on many of our products, and we know that the products with the silicate resins, compared to a zinc-filled silicate system versus an epoxy-based zinc system, there is a notable difference in embodied carbon. So it's kind of early days on this topic, but I think it's nice to be at the forefront of it.
You mentioned the pressure that's on folks in the industry right now, causing them to take a second look at silicates, for example. So it's no surprise that organics have become so well understood and that there's so much apparent flexibility regarding what we can do with these waste streams. Everyone who was involved found a way to profit from those, or we could say it another way, everybody who was involved found a way to reduce a disposal cost. So what I gather from this conversation is that non-petroleum-based feedstock processes are at a different stage of their maturity. They are influenced more and more by external pressures, market pressures, and social pressures. So my question is, are we advancing? Are we finding new ways to process these feedstocks or to redirect these waste byproducts?
So yes, a resounding yes. The emphasis on using green or sustainable or non-petroleum based feedstocks has been an area of research for quite some time. It's primarily been at the university level because the funding at the at the high levels, at the corporate level, is really just focused on, selling the products that make money. That's business, right? We live in a capitalist society. That's what we do. Fine. But I will tell you, at the American Coding Show this year, most of these coding shows, they will have a poster session. And the poster session is for university students to present their research. And it ranges from undergraduate to graduate level research. And this year, of the 36 poster sessions, I've counted at least 14. So getting close to half, but over a third are focused on more renewable materials. I'll give you an example. Corrosion-resistant soybean extract containing fluoropolymer coatings, vegetable oil-based waterborne 9-isocyanate polyurethane coating, reprocessing ability of cottonseed oil-based UV curable coatings. So this work is ongoing. As I said, it's being done primarily at the university level, and it's right now mostly focused on biorenewables. I mentioned several oils, right? So it's this idea of using oils, so using a natural organic material instead of a synthesized organic material from oil. What you don't see a lot of is inorganic coating systems, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Organic chemistry is primarily what I studied. There's a lot you can do with it. It's highly reactive. For lack of a better term, you play with it a lot. You can create a lot of new, different, unique synthetic materials. Inorganic chemistry is a little bit different. It's a lot different. It's just not the same type of reaction chemistry. And the materials a lot of times don't have the properties of organic materials. So we talked about the silicates. They really do cure hard, and they have some degree of flexibility, but nothing like you would expect from, say, an elastomeric coating, for example. So the answer to this question, as I said earlier, is not simple. It's not black and white. But I always say, lean in to what we know and what we can do. And these inorganic silicate materials have been around for a long time. They've worked, they've protected structures against corrosion in some cases over 60 years. They're not bright and shiny. They're not high gloss, but they don't allow corrosion to occur when they're used in an inorganic zinc system. So that's a great place to start, and we shouldn't overlook those types of things. I do think it would be interesting to see the silicate chemistry studied more, because as I said, I don't think any of those poster sessions that I can tell were studying silicate chemistry. But, I think there could be a move to that, and it would be interesting to see what comes out of it.
It feels like a natural stopping point right here. So maybe you could tie a bow around all of this, and please make it a pretty shiny, glossy, organic resin bow. Somebody making a material selection or specification decision might hear this episode and wonder where they should go from here, or wonder what questions they should be asking en route to sustainable corrosion protection.
I think one of the most impactful things and most impactful questions to ask is, what do I need the coating to do? If it is protective, what is it protecting? And then seek out the highest performing protective coating. If you can keep a structure lasting and in use as long as possible, that is going to help your carbon footprint the most. So sometimes there is fear of, terms like fluoropolymer. Fluoropolymers do last a very long time in the realm of organic coatings. There is a lot of concern around the materials that go into them, but I would caution anybody who is dealing with those types of materials that there is a lot of complexity and very few people globally that really understand the chemistry. So seek out the knowledge, ask the questions, and certainly avoid trading off a coating that could last decades for a coating that lasts, say, 10 years, that's going to have to be repainted, say, in a 60-year life cycle. A fluoropolymer, honestly, could withstand 60 years. An inorganic coating could withstand longer than 60 years. Most urethanes, I would say acrylics, obviously, alkyds, 10 to 20 effectively, maybe 30. But if we go with 20, well, that's 3 painting cycles. So that's an impact. And you really have to think about what your impact is going to be. So I think leaning in and really focusing on how to keep that asset functioning and in service with the least amount of maintenance required is the biggest impact you can have. And so that's a shift. That's a shift away from the old days of I want the cheapest, most available paint to I want the best paint that lasts the longest. And if you look at most structures and most assets, the cost of the paint is pretty small. So it's just a way of rethinking something. And what it really is doing is it's forcing the industries that rely on paint, this thing that, as I mentioned earlier, bores most people. Most people would rather maybe even go to the doctor than listen to a discussion on paint. It really forces them to recognize what it actually is providing. Construct that steel bridge without a protective mechanism against corrosion, without a protective coating that protects against corrosion. A lot of problems, right? So paint does a very important job. And it's just something, we're not cheerleaders for what we do, right? That's why we're here. We're trying to make it exciting. I don't know if I've succeeded in that today. What I would leave you with is think about what you need for your asset, the life cycle that you want for that asset, and think long, think big, think the best, and try to find a coating system that will get you there.
And on that encouraging note, we should transition now to the time-honored Red Bucket tradition for questions. Kristen Blankenship, are you ready?
No, but I'll do it.
You watched the Queen's Gambit TV show, which is about a chess player. There are scenes in which the protagonist lulls herself to sleep by playing imaginary chess matches on the ceiling of the room she's sleeping in. And I wonder, do you do that with molecules?
I hate to admit that I kind of do see molecules. It's like the movie, I see dead people. No, when I think about paint and coatings and I think about, I hear the word urethane, I see long chains of carbon because I always think of aliphatic urethanes because they weather better. So I'm not going to lie. Yes, admittedly I do.
Second question, and this one is a repeat of one that I asked Paula Chamus on our episode on surface-tolerant epoxy mastics. Go listen to that if you haven't. But if you were given a superpower based on your character traits, what superpower would that be?
I like to think I'm very collaborative. I like everybody to be on a team and work together. Fun fact, I was not only a cheerleader for many years as a youngster, but I was the captain of our cheerleading squad. I was the one telling my girls to cheer when we were 20 points down in the fourth quarter. But I'm enthusiastic and I like people to work together and I like to figure out how to get everybody else to find their superpower. So that's can be tough sometimes and frustrating, but it's also very rewarding.
I admire that. I don't know that that's going to be the next Marvel film, but it is commendable. So here's question number 3. Would you rather water ski behind a cruise ship or stand on the wing of a biplane in flight like a barnstormer?
Stand on the wing of a biplane.
Okay, why?
Just sounds awesome. I mean, I'm sure I'll die either way, so I'd rather be up in the sky.
That's as good a reason as any. And finally, question number 4. It shouldn't surprise anyone that I'm asking a food question, but does ketchup belong on a hot dog?
No.
That's the only correct answer.
Well, to me, where do hot dogs really, to me at least, they come from my German ancestors and sausage. And I don't think the Germans were putting ketchup. They were putting mustard. So That's just me. I don't know. I'm going to get in trouble. But
look, it's important to stand for what we believe in. And on that note, I believe this has been a great conversation. Kristen Blankenship, thank you for joining the Red Bucket. Come back and talk about molecules anytime.
Thank you. It was fun. I'd love to do it again.